They told me my late father left nothing but a locked workshop. What I found inside changed everything. That's the short version, anyway. The kind you'd put on the back of a book you'd never have the guts to write. The truth, like most things, is a lot messier. It started on my 18th birthday, the day the state of Oregon officially ran out of reasons to be responsible for me. If you've ever been in a situation like that, maybe you know what I'm talking about. If you feel this, maybe hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. It's for anyone who's ever been told they came from nothing. The air in the group home office smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant, a combination that had scented the last 6 years of my life. Mrs. Gable, my case manager, slid a manila envelope across her laminated desk. It made a soft, final sound. Inside was a bus ticket to a town I'd never heard of, $184 in cash, and a single, heavy, old-fashioned iron key. "Leo," she said, her voice trying for warmth, but landing somewhere in the region of tired sympathy. "This is it. Everything your father, Daniel, left in his estate." I stared at the key. It was ornate, rusted at the edges, the kind of thing you see in a fantasy movie, not a state-issued envelope. "That's it? A key?" "And the property it opens," she clarified, tapping a thin file. "A small parcel of land. There's a house, though I'm told it's uninhabitable, and a workshop. The key is for the workshop. The house is unlocked, or, more accurately, falling down." She sighed, a puff of air that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 similar conversations. "Frankly, Leo, the property is a liability. There are years of back taxes owed, significant liens. The state's advice, and mine, is to let the county foreclose. Take the cash, take the bus ticket, and start fresh somewhere else. Portland, maybe. You're a legal adult now. You're free." Free. The word echoed in the small, stuffy room. I had been dreaming of freedom for 2,190 days. Freedom from shared bedrooms and mandatory meal times, and the quiet, persistent humiliation of being a ward of the state. But this didn't feel like freedom. It felt like being pushed off a cliff with a key in my pocket instead of a parachute. My father. A man I barely remembered, a ghost made of faint impressions. The smell of sawdust, the scratch of a wool coat, the low rumble of a voice I couldn't quite place. He died 2 years ago, a brief notice forwarded to the home, another fact in a file. I'd felt a dull ache, the kind you get from an old injury on a cold day, but not grief. How can you grieve someone who was already gone? He'd left me here, in this system, years before he'd actually died. "Why the workshop?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow to my own ears. "Why is it locked if the house is open?" Mrs. Gable shrugged, a gesture of finality. "No one knows. The county assessors couldn't get in. No other key was ever found. It was in his will, such as it was. A single sentence, written on a napkin and notarized, apparently. My son Leo gets the key to my workshop and everything inside it." She leaned forward, her professional mask slipping for just a second. "Listen to me. The man left you with a massive debt. He abandoned you to the system. Whatever is in that workshop, it isn't worth the trouble it's attached to. It's probably just a pile of old tools. Let it go. It's the last chain connecting you to a past you need to escape." Her advice was sensible. It was logical. It was what any rational person would do. But as I picked up the key, its cold, solid weight felt like the only real thing I'd held in years. It was a period at the end of a sentence I didn't understand. a question mark shaped like a key. The $184 was survival. The bus ticket was a path. But the key was a story. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the need to know how it ended. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I slid the key, the cash, and the ticket into the pocket of my worn jacket. The fabric was thin against my ribs. I stood up. Mrs. Gable stood too, extending a hand. I shook it. Her grip was firm, perfunctory. "Good luck, Leo," she said. The words were a dismissal. The door clicked shut behind me, and for the first time, it wouldn't be opening for me again. I walked down the long, polished hallway, past the rooms that had never been mine, toward a front door that led to a world that didn't know my name. The key in my pocket felt impossibly heavy, like an anchor. Or maybe, just maybe, like a root. The bus station was a purgatory of flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of diesel fumes. I bought a lukewarm coffee and a stale pastry with the state's money, watching people greet their families with hugs and tears. They were arriving somewhere. I was just leaving. My destination was a dot on a map called Havenwood, a place I couldn't picture. The name sounded too peaceful for anything connected to my life. I found my bus, the engine idling with a deep, guttural rumble. I took a window seat, pressing my forehead against the cool glass as the city's familiar gray landscape began to slide by. The journey was a slow dissolving of one world into another. Concrete and steel gave way to strip malls, then suburbs, then wide, empty fields stitched together by fences. The sky opened up, a vast, indifferent blue. My memories of my father were like old photographs, faded and torn at the edges. I remembered a large, calloused hand holding mine as we walked through a forest. I remembered the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I remembered him trying to teach me how to skip stones on a river, his voice patient, the stones sinking with a sad little plunk every time I threw one. And then the memories soured. Raised voices from behind a closed door. My mother's crying. The day he packed a small bag and knelt in front of me, his face a mask of something I couldn't read. "I have to go away for a while, Leo," he'd said. "Be a good boy for your mom." A while turned into forever. My mom got sick not long after. First it was her body, then her mind. The state stepped in when I was 12. That was the end of that life, the start of this one. I had built a fortress around that abandonment. He left. He didn't love us. He was a coward, a failure. It was a simple, solid story that had gotten me through the last 6 years. It was a story I was starting to realize the iron key in my pocket might unlock, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what was inside. Hours bled into one another. The landscape grew wilder, the mountains in the distance sharpening against the sky. The bus emptied out stop by stop until it was just me, the driver, and an old woman knitting in the front seat. Finally, the driver's voice crackled over the intercom. "Havenwood. Next stop, Havenwood." I gathered my single backpack, the sum total of my worldly possessions, and stood as the bus hissed to a stop in front of a one-story building with a faded sign that read, "General Store." The door opened, and I stepped out into a wall of silence. It wasn't an absence of noise, it was a presence. The whisper of wind in the towering pines, the distant caw of a crow, the creak of the store's sign. The air was clean and cold, smelling of pine and wet dirt. The town, if you could call it that, was a single street with a handful of buildings that looked like they'd been there for a century. The bus pulled away with another hydraulic sigh, leaving me alone in a cloud of exhaust. I was an island. I checked the address on the file. 417 Raven Road. A woman arranging vegetables in front of the store pointed me down a gravel path at the edge of town. "About a mile that way," she said, her eyes lingering on me with a curiosity that wasn't unkind. "Daniel's old place. Been empty a long time." The walk was surreal. The road was more of a suggestion, flanked by dense, dark woods. The silence deepened. My city-worn senses were on high alert, every snapped twig and rustle of leaves sounding like a threat. After what felt like an eternity, the trees thinned, and I saw it. The property was even worse than Mrs. Gable had described. A sagging, gray house with boarded-up windows stood in a yard choked with weeds and tangled blackberry bushes. The porch roof had collapsed on one side, giving the whole structure a defeated, lopsided grin. It wasn't uninhabitable, it was a corpse of a house. But behind it, set back near the tree line, was the workshop. It was a stark contrast to the house. It was a simple, rectangular building made of dark, weathered wood with a rust-colored metal roof. It had no windows, only a single, wide door made of heavy planks. It looked less like a building and more like a vault. Solid, impenetrable. It seemed to have weathered the years far better than the house, as if protected by some unseen force. I picked my way through the overgrown yard, the thorns snagging at my jeans. The air grew colder as I approached the workshop. There was a large, industrial-looking padlock on the door, caked in rust. It looked ancient, fused shut by time and weather. My heart sank. There was no way my key would fit this. This was a modern lock. Then I saw it. Below the big padlock, almost hidden by the shadows, was a smaller, inset lock, the kind built into the door itself. It was dark, almost black with age, and shaped to fit the ornate head of the key in my pocket. My hand trembled slightly as I pulled it out. It felt like a ritual, a moment suspended in time. I pushed the key into the lock. It scraped, resisted, then slid home with a heavy, grating sound. For a long moment I just stood there, my hand on the key. Part of me wanted to turn and walk away, to listen to Mrs. Gable's advice, to leave the ghosts of the past buried. But I couldn't. I had to know. I took a deep breath, gripped the key with both hands, and turned. The mechanism inside screamed in protest, a long, groaning shriek of metal on metal. Then, with a final, definitive thud, the lock gave way. The door shifted inward an inch, breaking a seal of dust and time. I pulled it open. The smell hit me first. Not decay or damp, like the house. It was the smell I remembered from my earliest childhood. The clean, sharp scent of cut wood, the faint tang of oil, and something else. Something that smelled like purpose. The interior of the workshop was dark, the only light coming from the open doorway behind me. I fumbled along the wall until my fingers found a switch. I flicked it, not expecting anything to happen. To my astonishment, a string of bare bulbs flickered to life, humming softly and casting a warm, yellow glow over the space. My breath caught in my throat. This was no pile of old, forgotten tools. This was a place frozen in time. A massive workbench ran the length of one wall, covered in neatly organized tools. Chisels, planes, and saws hung in perfect order on a pegboard above it. Jars of screws, nails, and bolts were lined up on shelves, their contents meticulously labeled in a familiar, blocky handwriting. On the other side of the room were larger machines, a table saw, a drill press, a lathe, all covered in light canvas tarps like sleeping giants. It was dusty, yes, but it wasn't abandoned. It was preserved. It felt like my father had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any minute. I walked deeper into the room, my boots echoing softly on the concrete floor. In the center of the workshop, on a small, sturdy table, sat a single object, a metal box. It was an old military-style ammunition can, painted dark green, with a heavy latch on the front. On top of it was a sealed envelope. My name, Leo, was written on it in that same handwriting. My whole body went cold. This was it. This was what he'd locked away. My fingers felt clumsy and numb as I picked up the envelope and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. The letter began without preamble. Leo, if you are reading this, it means two things. First, that I am gone. For that, I am more sorry than you will ever know. Second, it means you didn't listen to them. It means you chose to come here. I hoped you would. I counted on it. There is so much I need to explain, and so little time on this paper. I can't tell you everything, not yet. But you need to know this. I did not abandon you. Everything I have done, every day I have been gone, has been to protect you. I had to sit down. My legs felt weak. I sank onto a nearby stool, the words blurring in front of my eyes. Protect me? From what? He was the one I had needed protection from his absence, from the chaos his leaving created. I read on, my heart pounding against my ribs. The world is not as it seems, son. There are bad people, and I got tangled up with them a long time ago, trying to get the money for your mother's treatment. I thought I could outsmart them. I was wrong. When I realized the danger we were in, the only way to keep them away from you and your mom was to disappear. To make them think I was a deadbeat who ran out on his family. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. It broke me every single day. The things in this box are the beginning of the story. Trust no one, especially anyone who offers you an easy way out of this place. This land, this workshop, it's more than just property. It's the only thing I have left to give you. It's a chance. Be careful. Be smart. I love you, Dad. I read the letter again, and then a third time. The words felt alien, like they were from a language I didn't speak. Dad. He hadn't even signed it that way in the birthday cards he'd sent for the first few years, which had always been signed Daniel. The fortress I had built around my heart, the simple, solid story of his abandonment, began to crumble. Cracks were forming, and I didn't know what was pouring in. Was it truth, or was it just a more elaborate lie, a dead man's attempt to excuse his own weakness? I looked at the green metal box, the beginning of the story he'd written. The latch was stiff, but it opened with a loud clang. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in yellowing foam, were not tools or valuables. It was full of notebooks, dozens of them, and beneath them, stacks of photographs and bundles of documents held together with rubber bands that were so old they were starting to crack. This wasn't a workshop. It was an archive. It was an investigation. My father wasn't just a woodworker. He was something else entirely. And I was standing in the middle of his secret life, with a letter in my hand that had just rewritten my own. The next morning, I woke up on a pile of canvas tarps in the corner of the workshop, my neck stiff and my mind a fog of confusion and exhaustion. I'd spent half the night staring at the contents of the box, not yet ready to dive in, but unable to look away. The sheer volume of it was overwhelming. The notebooks were filled with his dense, blocky script, detailing dates, names, financial transactions. The photographs were of men in suits, of construction sites, of license plates. It felt dangerous. It felt real. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a harsh, unwelcome sound in the quiet space. It was a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, then answered. "Leo, this is Susan Albright, the attorney from the state's Transitional Services Office. We spoke briefly." Her voice was exactly as I remembered from the brief, clinical phone call before I'd left the group home. Crisp, professional, and devoid of emotion. "I'm calling about the property, the Havenwood parcel." "Right," I said, my own voice thick with sleep. "I have some news. It's unexpected, and I believe it's in your best interest. I've been contacted by a legal representative for a corporation called North Cascade Development. It seems they have an interest in the area, and they've been acquiring delinquent properties for a new resort project. They are aware of the significant tax liens on your father's property." She paused, and I could hear the rustle of papers. "They've made an offer. They are willing to absorb the entirety of the outstanding debt, the back taxes, the liens, all of it. In exchange, you would sign over the deed. They are also offering what they call a relocation and nuisance stipend of $5,000. $5,000. The number seemed astronomical. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life. It was a new start. It was a clean break. It was exactly what Mrs. Gable had told me to take. It was the easy way out. "Trust no one," my father's letter had warned, "especially anyone who offers you an easy way out of this place." "Leo, are you there?" Ms. Albright's voice cut through the static in my head. "I'm here," I said slowly. "North Cascade Development. Do you know anything about them?" There was another pause. "They're a legitimate, well-capitalized firm based out of Seattle. I've looked into them. Their paperwork is in order. From a legal standpoint, this is an incredibly generous offer. It turns a massive financial liability into a net positive for you. Frankly, it's a miracle. I've already drawn up the preliminary paperwork. I can email it to you. All you'd have to do is sign, and the funds would be wired within 48 hours. A miracle. Or a trap. I looked around the workshop, at the silent, sleeping machines, at the metal box sitting open on the table. This place was a chance, my father had said. These people didn't want the land. They wanted what was on it. Or, more specifically, what was in it. They wanted this box and the story it contained, buried forever under a golf course or a luxury spa. "I need to think about it," I said. The words felt heavy in my mouth. Ms. Albright's tone cooled slightly. "Think about what exactly?" "Leo, let me be blunt. You are 18 years old with less than $200 to your name. You have no job, no home. This is a lifeline. There is nothing on that property worth $5,000, let alone the tens of thousands in debt attached to it. Do not let sentimentality cloud your judgment. Your father left you a mess. These people are offering to clean it up and pay you for the privilege. In my professional opinion, you should take the deal before they change their minds." Her logic was a hammer, chipping away at the fragile new reality I was trying to build. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to agree, to take the money and run, to finally have the freedom I'd always craved. But my father's words echoed louder. "I love you. Be smart." "I'll call you back," I said, and hung up before she could argue further. The silence that followed was deafening. I was at a crossroads. Down one path was a future bought and paid for. Down the other was, what? A dead man's obsession? A conspiracy theory scribbled in a stack of notebooks? A fight I had no possible way of winning? I felt a wave of anger at my father. Why would he do this to me? Why leave me this impossible choice? It was just another kind of abandonment. And that's when I realized, this story I'm telling you, it isn't just about a workshop. It's about that moment. The moment when you're handed a choice that will define who you are. The easy path that leads away from your past, and the hard path that leads right through the heart of it. Have you ever been there? Standing at a fork in the road where your life could split into two completely different futures. If you have, I want you to tell me about it in the comments. Because in that moment, I felt completely and utterly alone. And knowing that someone else out there has faced that same kind of impossible decision, well, it makes all the difference. I needed to make a choice. And to do that, I had to finally open the notebooks. I had to read my father's story. I spent the rest of that day and all through the night immersed in my father's world. I made a pot of coffee on an old hot plate I found, the bitter smell mingling with the scent of sawdust. I sat at his workbench, the bare bulbs humming overhead, and I read. The first notebook started 15 years ago. It began with my mother's diagnosis. It wasn't a journal of feelings, but a log of facts. Doctor's appointments, experimental treatment costs, the rejections from the insurance company. It was a cold, brutal accounting of a family slowly being crushed by a broken system. Then, the entries changed. He started taking on side jobs, cash-only carpentry work for a man he named only as R. The money was good, too good. Soon, the jobs weren't just carpentry. He was asked to build hidden compartments in vehicles, secret rooms in warehouses. He was a craftsman, and his skill was being used for things he knew were wrong. But the medical bills kept coming. He wrote about his justifications, the lines he told himself he wouldn't cross. But the lines kept moving. R was a man named Roman Petrov, a name that would appear again and again. He was a low-level operator in a criminal syndicate, a man who saw my father's desperation and his talent as a resource to be exploited. Then came the entry that made my blood run cold. Petrov had offered him a job that was a point of no return. This was the endgame of a criminal enterprise that had started decades ago. My father had refused the job. He had told Petrov he was out. But you don't just walk away from people like that. The threats started, first against him, then against my mother, and then me. The notebook detailed his terror. He knew he couldn't go to the police. Petrov had people on the inside. His only option was to disappear, to create a new narrative. He staged a final, horrible fight with my mother, a fight she was in on. He packed his bag and left, becoming the deadbeat father, the man who ran from his responsibilities. He moved to Havenwood, to this isolated property he'd inherited from his own father, and he began to watch them. He spent the next decade of his life in the shadows, gathering evidence. He used his woodworking skills as a cover, but his real work was this: the notebooks, the photographs, the careful documentation of every crime, every transaction, every threat. He was building a case, piece by piece, in the one place they would never think to look. I found a separate notebook detailing his finances. He lived on almost nothing, pouring every spare cent he made from odd jobs into a secret account. He was saving it, for me. The final entries were written in a shaky hand. He wrote about a persistent cough, about a weakness in his chest. He knew he was running out of time. He wrote about his fear that his work would be for nothing, that the property would be seized for taxes before I was old enough to claim it. He'd calculated it down to the month. He knew the debt would be massive, but he also knew it would create a legal tangle that might, just might, buy enough time for me to turn 18 and get this key. It was a desperate, brilliant, insane plan. A plan that had cost him everything. I cried. I sat there at his workbench, in the warm glow of the lights he'd strung up, and I cried for the first time since I was a child. I cried for the father I thought I'd lost to cowardice and found again in heroism. I cried for the years we'd missed. I cried for the lonely, terrifying life he'd lived in this workshop, surrounded by the evidence of a darkness he was trying to hold back from the world, from me. And I cried for the boy who had spent 6 years believing he was unloved and abandoned. The $5,000 offer wasn't a lifeline. It was an insult. It was them trying to buy my father's entire life's work, his sacrifice, for the price of a used car. The choice wasn't a choice at all. There was no easy path and hard path. There was only my father's path, the one that led right through the heart of the fight. But as I looked at the piles of evidence, a new, cold dread settled in my stomach. This was a dead man's work. Notebooks and photos. Was it enough? Was it anything? Against a multi-million-dollar corporation with a team of lawyers? I was just a kid, an 18-year-old orphan with no resources and no power. What could I possibly do? Doubt is a cold, creeping thing. It seeps into the cracks of your resolve and tries to freeze you in place. For hours I sat there, paralyzed by the sheer scale of what my father had uncovered and the insignificance of my own position. Roman Petrov, North Cascade Development. These were not just names in a notebook. They were powerful, dangerous forces. My father had spent a decade in hiding from them. What would they do to me if I came forward? I thought about the $5,000 again, not as a sellout, but as an escape. I could take that money, disappear myself. I could honor my father by living, by being safe, by not throwing my life away on a fight that was already lost. His letter hadn't told me to fight. It had told me to be smart. Maybe the smart thing to do was to survive. I paced the length of the workshop, the concrete cold under my thin shoes. I ran my hands over the smooth, worn wood of the workbench, over the cold steel of the lathe. This was his sanctuary, his command center. He had never given up. He had worked until the very end. Could I be the one to let it all be for nothing? I went back to the metal box, thinking maybe I had missed something, some final instruction, some piece of advice. I started taking everything out, laying the notebooks and bundles of photos on the table in neat piles. The box was almost empty when my fingers brushed against a false bottom. It was a thin sheet of metal, seamlessly fitted. I pried at it with a screwdriver from the pegboard. It came loose with a soft pop. Beneath it was a final compartment, and inside that compartment were 2 things. The first was another letter, a single page. The second was a stack of $100 bills, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. It was a thick stack, a life-changingly thick stack. I picked up the letter first, my hand shaking again. "Leo," it began, "this is the real choice. The evidence you've found is my life's work. It is the truth. But the truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it gets you killed. These people are ruthless. If you use that evidence, if you go to the authorities, they will come after you with everything they have. They will use their lawyers and their money to crush you, to paint you as a liar, to paint me as a disgruntled crank. It will be a long, ugly, and dangerous war, and there is no guarantee you will win." He continued, "The money in this box is your other option. It's everything I saved. It's enough for you to go anywhere, to start over completely. You could build a new life, a safe life. You could go to college. You could be happy. No one would blame you. I would not blame you. I want you to be safe more than I want justice. Your life is more important than my vengeance. So this is the inheritance, son. Not the land, not the workshop. The choice. You can take the truth and fight, or you can take the money and live. Whatever you decide, know that I am proud of the man you have become. Know that I love you. I slowly unwrapped the oilcloth. I didn't count the money, but I knew it was more than the $5,000 from the developers. It was probably 10 times that. It was safety. It was a future. It was a clean slate. Everything my father had just said was true. The smart thing, the logical thing, the sane thing to do was to take the money and vanish. Let the developers have this cursed piece of land. Let them build their resort over the secrets and the pain. I owed my father nothing. He had made his choices. I had a right to make mine. I had a right to be free. I stood there for what felt like a lifetime, the letter in one hand and the money in the other. Truth or life, justice or freedom. It was the cruelest test imaginable. I closed my eyes and tried to picture my father's face. Not the faded photograph in my memory, but the man who had filled these notebooks. The man who had spent 10 years alone in this workshop, fighting a silent war. The man who had given up everything so that I could have this choice. And in the quiet of that room, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and purpose, I knew what I had to do. His legacy wasn't the evidence. It wasn't the money. His legacy was the choice itself. And I had to choose the one he would have made. I had to fight. The decision settled over me not like a weight, but like a shield. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer in charge. Purpose was. I carefully rewrapped the money and put it back in the hidden compartment. It wasn't my money. It was a war chest. I gathered the most critical notebooks, the ones detailing the connection between Roman Petrov and North Cascade development, and a handful of the most damning photographs. Then I picked up my phone. I dialed Susan Albright. She answered on the second ring. "Leo, I was expecting your call. Have you come to your senses about the offer?" "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I have. I'm rejecting the offer from North Cascade Development." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "You're what?" "Leo, I strongly advise you against that. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get out from under this." "I'm not interested in getting out from under it," I said. "I'm interested in why they want it so badly. Ms. Albright, I need to hire you. Or if this is beyond your scope, I need you to help me find a lawyer who can handle this." "Hire me?" She sounded genuinely bewildered. "With what money? This kind of litigation, fighting a developer, it costs a fortune." "I have a retainer," I said, thinking of the cash in the box. "And I have evidence. My father, he didn't just leave me this property. He left me his work. He was investigating North Cascade Development for years. He has proof of criminal activity, extortion, racketeering, all connected to their founder." Another silence, this one longer, heavier. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, the shift from a social services lawyer dealing with a troubled kid to a litigator sniffing out a real case. "What kind of evidence?" she asked, her voice sharp, all business now. "Notebooks, photographs, financial records. Enough to show that their entire operation is built on a foundation of crime. He kept everything." "Where are you right now, Leo?" "I'm at the workshop." "Don't leave," she commanded. "Don't talk to anyone. Don't let anyone on the property. I have a colleague, a former prosecutor, who specializes in corporate fraud cases. I'm going to call him. I'm going to drive up there myself. I can be in Havenwood by late afternoon. Just sit tight. And Leo?" "Yeah." "Don't touch anything else." She hung up. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The first domino had fallen. There was no going back now. I spent the next few hours waiting, the adrenaline slowly giving way to a profound sense of calm. I wasn't just an orphan aging out of the system anymore. I wasn't Daniel's abandoned son. I was his partner, his successor. I was here to finish the job. I walked around the workshop, seeing it with new eyes. It wasn't a dusty relic of the past. It was a living testament to a man's love for his son. Every neatly hung tool, every labeled jar, spoke of a mind that craved order in a world of chaos. He had built this place as a fortress for his mind, a place where he could make sense of the ugliness he was fighting. I found a small alcove I hadn't noticed before, tucked behind the drill press. In it was a small cot-like bed, neatly made. On a crate next to it was a worn paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird and a framed photograph. It was a picture of my mother, holding me as a toddler. We were both laughing. She was beautiful, and I was impossibly small. My father wasn't in the picture, but I knew he was the one holding the camera. He had kept us with him all this time. This was where he had lived. This was his home. The word home had always been a painful one for me. It was a place I'd been taken from. But standing there, in that dusty, quiet workshop, I realized what it truly meant. Home isn't four walls and a roof. It's a purpose. It's a place where you know who you are and what you're fighting for. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was home. Late that afternoon, a sensible sedan I recognized as Ms. Albright's crunched up the gravel road. She got out, looking out of place in her city suit against the wild, overgrown backdrop. With her was a man, older, with tired eyes and a face that looked like it had seen too much. He introduced himself as David Chen, the former prosecutor she'd mentioned. I led them to the workshop. As I opened the door and flicked on the lights, I saw Ms. Albright's professional composure crack. She stared at the organized space, her eyes wide with a dawning understanding. This was not the forgotten mess of a deadbeat dad. This was something else entirely. I laid the notebooks out on the workbench. For the next 2 hours, David Chen barely spoke. He read, his eyes scanning the pages with an unnerving intensity, occasionally holding a photograph up to the light. Ms. Albright stood beside him, her expression shifting from skepticism to shock to a kind of fierce, protective focus. Finally, Chen closed the last notebook and looked at me. His tired eyes were now sharp, alert. "Your father was a remarkable man," he said, his voice quiet but carrying immense weight. "And a very brave one. He's built a nearly perfect case for conspiracy and racketeering. Half of this is circumstantial, but the financial records, the timeline he establishes, it's meticulous. It connects Roman Petrov's criminal history directly to the seed money for North Cascades' initial incorporation." He looked at Ms. Albright. "Susan, this is bigger than a civil suit. This is a criminal case, a big one." Ms. Albright nodded, her gaze fixed on me. "Leo," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, "you understand what this means, right? If we move forward with this, your life is going to change. They will try to discredit you, to intimidate you. You will be at the center of a very dangerous storm. I looked at the photograph of my mother and me sitting on the crate next to my father's bed. I thought of his last letter, of the choice he had given me. He had given me the option to be safe, but he had also given me the chance to be brave. He spent more than a decade of his life gathering this, I said, my voice steady. He died believing it mattered. I'm not going to be the one to prove him wrong. David Chen allowed himself a small, grim smile. Good, he said. Then let's get to work. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal strategy and quiet preparation. David and Susan worked with a ferocity that stunned me. They used a portion of the money from the box to hire a forensic accountant and a private investigator to corroborate my father's findings. Every claim he'd made in his notebooks, every financial link he'd suspected, was proven to be true. They were building an ironclad case, preparing to take it not to the local police, but directly to the state attorney general's office, bypassing the corruption my father had feared. My role was to stay put, to stay quiet. I lived in the workshop, cleaning it, organizing it, learning its rhythms. I felt my father's presence in the grain of the wood, in the heft of a well-balanced hammer. I wasn't just protecting his evidence anymore. I was becoming the steward of his legacy. I started reading his books on woodworking, and in the evenings I'd practice, my clumsy first attempts slowly growing more confident. I was shaping wood, but I was also reshaping myself. One evening, a black SUV I didn't recognize pulled up the road and stopped at the edge of the property. A man in an expensive suit got out. He didn't approach the workshop, just stood there, staring at it for a long moment. He was older, with slicked-back gray hair and a cold, predatory stillness. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was Roman Petrov. He was delivering a message. We see you. We know where you are. He got back in his car and drove away. The fear returned, sharp and acidic. But this time, it didn't paralyze me. It focused me. It was a reminder of what was at stake. This wasn't an abstract legal battle. It was a fight against men like him, men who believed they could buy and bully their way through the world. The next day, I called Ms. Albright and told her I was ready to give my official statement. The story broke a month later. It wasn't just a local news item, it was a statewide scandal. The Attorney General announced a sweeping investigation into North Cascade development, citing evidence of organized crime, fraud, and racketeering. Roman Petrov and two of his top executives were indicted. The company's assets were frozen. The resort project was dead. It wasn't a clean, simple victory. The legal battles would likely go on for years. Petrov's lawyers immediately went on the offensive, painting my father as a delusional criminal and me as a greedy opportunist. My name was in the papers, my face on the news. I became a story, the orphan who brought down a corporate giant. But I knew the truth. I hadn't done it. My father had. I had just picked up the tools he'd left for me and finished the job. The liens on the property were eventually cleared as part of the legal proceedings. The land, the house, the workshop, they were mine, free and clear. The remaining money from the hidden compartment was enough to fix the house, to pay the taxes for the foreseeable future, to live. I could have gone anywhere, done anything, but I stayed. I stayed in Havenwood. The town that had been a strange, silent place was slowly becoming a community. People would nod at me in the general store. The woman who had given me directions that first day brought me a homemade apple pie. They knew the broad strokes of the story, and they respected the quiet kid in Daniel's old workshop. They had respected Daniel, too, I learned. They'd seen him as a quiet, solitary man, but a good one. A man who kept to himself, but was always willing to help a neighbor with a broken fence or a leaky roof. They hadn't known his secret, but they had known his character. I started fixing up the house, using the skills I was learning in the workshop. It was slow, hard work, but every board I replaced, every window I glazed, felt like an act of reclamation. I wasn't just rebuilding a house, I was rebuilding a home that had been broken for too long. I was putting my family back together, one nail at a time. The workshop remained my sanctuary. It was where I went to think, to work, to feel close to my father. His presence was no longer a ghostly ache. It was a warm, steadying force. His inheritance wasn't just the choice, or the evidence, or the money. It was a trade. He had traded his life so that I could have mine. He had lived in the shadows so I could one day stand in the sun. And that brings me back to you. We all inherit something. Sometimes it's money or property, but sometimes it's a story that needs a new ending. It's a fight that needs a new champion. It's a choice between the easy road and the right one. My father's story taught me that inheritance isn't what you are given, it's what you choose to do with it. It's about picking up the tools you're handed and building something true. So I want to ask you again, what have you inherited? Not just from your family, but from your life, from your struggles. What story is waiting for you to finish? Let me know in the comments below. I read every one, and I believe, just like my father did, that our stories are the most powerful things we have. If this story meant something to you, if it gave you a little bit of hope or a little bit of strength, consider subscribing. We're building a community here, a place for people who know what it's like to fight for their home, whatever that may be. I'm Leo, and this is just the beginning of my story.